Hi, this is Jeff Curto, and welcome to episode number 47 of Camera Position, a podcast about the creative side of photography. Well, for this episode of Camera Position, what I'd like to do is spend some time talking about focus, or lack of focus, or the idea of depth of field. There's some interesting things that I've been seeing lately and some things I've been thinking about relative to my own work and the work of some interesting artists that I've seen out there. So I thought I'd just jump right in and talk a little bit about this idea of camera focus and depth of field and lack of depth of field, and we'll see where we wind up. As a view camera photographer, a guy using a 4x5, I'm the sort of guy who typically, in the sort of grand tradition of large format photography, typically what I do with the large format camera is maximize depth of field. That's been my sort of MO from the time I started using these cameras, and the ability to manipulate plane of focus with the camera and being able to alter that plane of focus in a lot of different ways and be able to get a greater depth of field than one ordinarily would be able to get from near distance to far distance has been really the hallmark of a lot of what I've done as a photographer. And yet, occasionally, just sometimes by luck of the draw and sometimes by plan, I have made some photographs that are not completely and totally in focus. And one that has been hanging over my desk at work in my office in my day job is this photograph of a tree, an olive tree in Umbria, where I had used a shallow depth of field. And there is just something so incredibly beautiful about that creamy, soft area of light beyond the tree. And the way that light looks. And I really keep looking at this picture and thinking, wow, I really need to do more with that. I need to do more with that sort of beautiful, creamy idea of lack of focus or lack of depth of field. That part of photography really intrigues me. And so I've started to look for photographers who have been using this idea of shallow depth of field. But what I really kind of wound up stumbling upon, or I guess not stumbling upon, but more just sort of examining and becoming very interested in, were photographers who are purposefully throwing parts of their images out of focus. And there is a real sort of an interesting, I don't know if it's a trend, but it certainly seems to be a group of photographers who are doing similar things. And, of course, there is this commercially available product now on the market. It's actually kind of a neat little tool. It's called the Lens Baby. And some of you may be familiar with it. I'm guessing that some of you might even own one. And it's this neat little thing that allows you to attach to the front of the camera, and what you do is essentially have kind of view camera-like controls of being able to adjust the plane of focus. And it's worth sort of taking a look at one if you find this to be an interesting idea. But I wanted to spend some time talking about some photographers who are using these strategies of shallow depth of field just because I find them really quite interesting. A photographer that I've known about for quite some time and whose work I've always enjoyed and admired is Keith Carter. And again, for most of these folks, all these folks, I'll put a link both in the podcast here, the enhanced podcast, and also on cameraposition.com on the blog page. Keith Carter, a Texas photographer, is a guy who has used soft focus or shallow depth of field in a lot of his work. And there is in his photography this wonderful sense of romanticism, a wonderful sense of nostalgic memory. In fact, to hear him talk about his work and about his experiences in photography is really to hear him talk about the things that have influenced him as a person over the years, and certainly kind of goes back to much of what, if you've been listening to Camera Position all along, much of what I've been talking about in terms of, well, what do you like? What are you passionate about? What interests you the most? And for Keith Carter, it seems as though it is this sort of amazing world that is out there. And his photographs really capture this spirit of almost a childlike wonder that goes along with looking at the world. And for a lot of his photographs, he uses either a view camera and manipulates the depth of field in sort of the wrong direction. So instead of doing what I typically do with the view camera, using swings and tilts to make the depth of field greater, Keith Carter tends to go with the swings and tilts going the opposite direction, and makes the depth of field less instead. He also uses a really inexpensive lens that has been altered to allow him to have very shallow depth of field that he kind of sticks onto the front of his medium format camera. I believe a Hasselblad is his tool of choice for the medium format work. And his work has been square for quite a long time too, which I think is also another interesting idea. That square is such a wonderfully interesting shape, difficult to work with, I think, but that static quality of the square, I think, is an interesting strategy for his work. So here's a guy who's making these photographs that are purposefully shallow in depth of field and really have this idea of nostalgia or memory, at least in my way of thinking about them, behind them. So there's one photographer, and another that I think is interesting is Miklos Gal. Gal is a Finnish photographer, and he has been working with this idea of very shallow depth of field as well. And his idea is to sort of look at the world from above in a way, and kind of make us feel like we're looking down on a toy-like world. I'm not terribly familiar with his work, and there is not that much that I've been able to find on the web in a sort of large amount, but he is somebody who came to my attention by virtue of actually a camera position listener, and we'll get to that listener in just a second. But another photographer that I had been familiar with only for just a short time is Tony Hofkinsheid, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that name correctly. Tony is a Toronto-based fine art and commercial photographer, but was born in the Netherlands. And it's unclear from his website, at least to me, whether he lives currently in Toronto or whether he lives in the Netherlands, but apparently splits his time between the two. And his work is also using this shallow depth of field and also kind of creating this toy-like world within the body of work, and I find that pretty interesting as well. But the work that I actually am most intrigued by, and I'm not saying this, Keith, because I know you're out there listening, is a guy named Keith Lutet, and Keith is an Australian photographer who's living in Singapore, and he came to my attention because he wrote me an email. He's a listener to the podcast, and he is working on a project, and I'm going to show you several of these pictures here in both camera position in the podcast, and also I will link to some in the blog. And the reason I'm really fond of these has to do with a lot of these same ideas that I've been talking about in camera position all along. What Keith has done is he's started down this path on this series, and the path is about his particular interest in the city that he lives in, Singapore, and Singapore as a model city. And here's a little bit of what Keith wrote about this work and to me in an email, and let me just sling this at you here and see what you think. In the 1950s, Singapore faced a serious problem of housing shortages, with the majority of people living in unhygienic, potentially hazardous slums and squatters' settlements. In response, the Singapore government passed the Housing and Development Act of 1960, which replaced the existing Singapore Improvement Trust with the Housing and Development Board, HDB. Which was empowered to provide Singapore with low-cost housing. Within 5 years, the HDB had constructed 50,000 apartments, which is just an astonishing fact all by itself. And today, Keith goes on to say 84% of Singaporeans currently live in high-rise HDB flats with high-density housing, the obvious and highly effective solution to the problem of overcrowding. The resulting HDB estates and towns are some of the world's most planned and sometimes too perfect communities. I've set myself the goal of visiting every HDB building in Singapore to represent ordinary life as seen by the Singaporean population from above. I think I can do this within 12 months. So these shots are of real subjects, but using the tilt shift to trick the eye into seeing the city as it was planned. And he's using on his digital Nikon camera an 85 millimeter tilt shift lens to create these images. Now, here's, first of all, I think the pictures are pretty terrific. I mean, I'm just really enthralled by the idea of this toy-like world, but it's toy-like in this sort of almost like the toy is too perfect. There's something just so wonderfully model city about it. And I think Keith really has hit the nail on the head. But more than that, take a look at what Keith has said in terms of what he's going to do. He wants to visit every building in Singapore of this type, and he thinks he can do it within 12 months. He's planned out a project. He's made a plan for what it is that he wants to accomplish. He's said, this is what I'm interested in. This is the way I think I can portray that interest in a photographic manner. And this is how long I'm going to give myself to accomplish the task. And from there on out, we'll see where it goes. And I just find these pictures to be really quite extraordinary. And the way in which he has used the shallow depth of field, I think is just really extraordinary. I think he's just done an excellent job of convincing me that I'm somewhere else, that I am in some other land, and that I am in some other place. And in really convincing me of his basic thesis, which is that this world is too perfect. This world of these HDB homes is too perfect a world. So really what I wanted to talk about today in camera position is a combination of things. I am fascinated by this shallow depth of field idea, and I want to play around with it a little bit and see if I can break myself out of that mold of my penchant for incredibly sharp focus, because I do find something really fascinating about that shallow depth of field, and especially with large format equipment, the ability to have this sort of, the word I use is creamy, a sort of incredibly smooth out of focus areas. But I'm also really intrigued by these photographers who are purposefully altering our perception through the way they are using shallow depth of field, or using sort of incorrect shallow depth of field. But also, I think we all have a lesson to learn from Keith, who has a basis for starting his project. He's fascinated by these places. He has a plan for continuing the project and what he wants to accomplish. And he's also sort of put it on the calendar. Within 12 months, he wants to accomplish the rest of the project. And I think that that is really a great goal for any photographer, to set up an idea that what we're going to do is over time, over a particular period of time, decide here we're going to do this and we're going to get it done by now, and ultimately I'll have blank. And that goal of blank is, a series of prints, an online slideshow, golly, anything you could think of that would be a method of sharing that work with the general public. So I guess the idea here is both I'm fascinated by the notion of these shallow depth of field images, both things that I might be able to do and other things that other photographers are doing. I'm really intrigued by the fact that what we can get is things as divergent as Keith Carter's sort of nostalgic memory pieces, and Keith Lutit's really a universe that is too perfect and too pristine to be real, and yet it really looks like it is. So the idea that the technique doesn't necessarily lock you into something that you are going to be forced to do. What technique does is allow you to express yourself, and that expression really comes out of your own personal interests and your own personal beliefs. And really those photographers that I think are doing some interesting things are coming out of an area of real strong belief in what it is that they're trying to accomplish, and a real basis of understanding of those kinds of things. So the idea here is to encourage you to go out and think about what it is that you are interested in, and kind of begin to think through a way in which you can best express that interest photographically, whether that interest can be expressed in straight traditional photographs, in color, in monochrome. And I think that that's obviously a big difference here between the Keith Carter photographs and any of the other three photographers, but especially Keith seems to be using these almost crayon colors, Keith Luted, and Keith Carter really using that black and white medium to be, this sort of throwback in memory, which I think really helps his work. But think about how you can best portray your idea. What is your idea, and what are you most interested in, and how are you going to best portray that idea? And go make some photographs and set yourself a clock. That clock could be a day, it could be a week, it could be a month, it could be Keith's 12 months that he's going to work on this project. And hopefully we'll see the results of his work. I've put a link to his website both here in Camera Position and also on cameraposition.com. So take a look at Keith's work, and take a look at Keith Carter's work, and see where you can go with these ideas of shallow depth of field, and whether that might fit into your own visual lexicon, whether you think that might be something that you might want to try to explore. So thank you very much for listening. I am delighted to have those of you who are here and continuing to listen to Camera Position here, and thanks so much for spreading the word about what we're doing here in Camera Position, and hopefully with any degree of luck, you'll tell some other folks that you're finding some interesting content here at www.cameraposition.com, the podcast about the creative side of photography. Camera Position is a proud member of the Photocast Network, your photo resource in the potosphere. photocastnetwork.com